Hi guys, but this Buildzoid here. I don't know how I managed to screw up my intro that badly, but yeah, there we go. Yeah, today we're going to be doing the final installment of Buildzoid rambles about all the X570 motherboards. Today we're going to be taking a look at Gigabyte, and yeah, we're going to start with the most expensive board because it's the first on Gigabyte's website, and this one's $700 on Newegg. So the Horus Extreme is like this board to me is defined by the fact that it has a 14 plus 2 phase V-core VRM that's actually truly 14 plus 2 phases. The bad news is that's not very useful. So it's very expensive to do. And I feel like that's a lot of what sort of defines this motherboard is just like a lot of things about this board are extremely expensive to do, and they don't necessarily actually achieve that much. So, like, for example, the VRM. Like, Gigabyte's using TDA 21472s, which are basically the best 70 amp smart power stages you can get, and they're also ridiculously expensive. The voltage controller is insanely expensive. Like, it's one of the most expensive ones you can get because it's the new Infineon XDP E132G5C, and it can support 16 phases. It's insanely expensive. Now the thing is, so basically on paper, this VRM, like if we just consider the controller and the MOSFETs, this is basically the best VRM you can get. If we consider, like, there is still potential for this VRM not necessarily to be the best, because it's not just about, the MOSFETs that you use, it's also about what you do with your output filtering. So yeah, depending on the configuration of like multi-layer ceramic capacitors in the CPU socket and behind the CPU socket and anywhere else on the, and then the bulk capacitors on the actual V-core power plane, you can, get different sort of performance out of the voltage regulator. Well, just call it performance in general as a basic generalization. And the funny thing is, though, that basically the VRM that Gigabyte has here is not that different from what you would get on any other motherboard, in terms of the component selection, ignoring, like, on the output filter. So, yeah, it's just kind of like, I don't know. This is the kind of thing that you'd have to hook the motherboard up to an oscilloscope and actually use an oscilloscope to check if there's a difference between, like, this VRM and what you get on the Master or what you get on the Crosshair, or any of the other motherboards. But like on paper, this could very well be the very best VRM on X570. And it is definitely the most expensive VRM on X570 because that controller is more expensive than the controller Gigabyte is using here is more expensive than a IR35201 with a full set of doublers. Like, it is that bad in terms of cost. So, yeah, like, it literally, you could not spend more on your controller if you tried. You could technically spend more on your total number of MOSFETs by doing, like, a 32 phase or something. But the controller alone, you can't buy a more expensive one. Anyway, so, yeah, that's, the VRM is ridiculous on this board. But it does have some benefits. And one of those benefits is that, well, you see these very nice high surface area finned heat sinks that Gigabyte has on the V-Core VRM. Well, those are also kind of expensive to do compared to the usual, like extruded aluminum fashion accessories. But the thing is, the VRM doesn't actually make much use of those. So Gigabyte decided, hey, if we run a heat pipe from those from one of the really nice V-Core, VRM heatsink fin stacks, to the chipset, we can run the chipset passive because the VRM is really not producing much heat, if any, like, is not producing much heat whatsoever. So there's no point really, just like those heat sinks aren't doing anything. So you may as well take all the heat the chipset is producing and dump it into those fin stacks to actually get some use out of them. The end result is that this board is actually fully passive, which is, like, I'd say paying $700 to get a passive motherboard is nuts because you could probably pay. Well, no, that's the thing is, like, I actually kind of thought about this, was just like, I'm surprised we haven't seen any motherboard vendor offer a passive upgrade kit for their motherboard, where it would basically just replace the stock chipset heatsink with like a aluminum block with a bunch of fins and a heat pipe, because the main problem with the chipset cooling is not so much that the chipset produces it does produce a pretty large amount of heat considering it's a chipset, but the biggest issue is where it's located. All of that heat, like if the chipset was where a north bridge normally lives, right around here in the middle of the board, then it wouldn't really be an issue because you just whack a big heatsink on it, the same as you do on the VRM, and you're fine. Right? But you can't whack a big heatsink on a chipset, which is sitting under all of your PCIe slots, because where would the GPUs go then? So the only way you'd be able to do that is if you had basically like a heat pipe running into a fin stack that would sit like next to the memory slots or something, right along here, because you can't really put a fin stack over between the CPU socket and the memory slots, because CPU coolers go there. And yeah, so because of the constraints of the ATX form factor, it's just like making that chipset passive is kind of awkward, especially on motherboards where you can't just use the VRM heatsink, because the VRM heatsink really here doesn't do anything, right? There's no real load being applied to it because the VRM is so damn efficient. But with a lot of other boards, it's like, yeah, just doing a passive heatsink, you'd have to come up with some intricate way of getting all of that heat from the chipset over here to like this area of the motherboard, because normally there's an M.2 slot right here, so you can't just put a fin stack over there either, as much as like that would be tempting, unless you had like a system where you had like a heatsink assembly that you have to remove every time you want to, whenever you want to install the M.2 drive, which would be relatively inconvenient, and you'd probably want to have some kind of protector plate over the chipset, because the chipset itself is just it's bare silicon, right? And you can never be like chipping the corner on, especially if you have a really lopsided heatsink, like it would not be that hard to chip the silicon of the chipset and potentially kill it. So yeah, I can understand why there's no, why we aren't seeing a bunch of passive motherboards, even though it would be possible. It's just that because of how much stuff you also have that sort of has to be, installable in the motherboard near to the chipset, is just kind of awkward to solve that. But this board manages it. I think more motherboards could have managed it, because a lot of motherboards have similarly efficient VRMs. It's just that most of them don't have heat sinks with quite so much surface area, so they're still stuck with fans, of course. But yeah, so Gigabyte gets away with doing the chipset passive. And what else is there? Well, the PCIe slot arrangement, I would really prefer if this had the same PCIe layout as like the MSI X570 Godlike. I think that would be really, really cool if the board supported that. But at the same time, well, it would make M.2 SSD locations kind of awkward. Like, that's the thing, is just, honestly, like, I think we should see more like M.2 SSD riser cards. I'm actually not sure why they don't do like a dedicated like reverse orientation PCIe slot, right? Because it's just a PCIe slot. So you'd make like you'd base your own standard off of an existing part. You'd run it in reverse direction, and you'd just have like a little expansion card that slots into it, and all of your M.2s would be on that. I think that would be really, really cool, because that would immediately, you would free up so much space on the board, right? Because the M.2 drives right now just sit on top of the board, and it's just like, well, you can't have a PCIe 1X slot if there's an M.2 drive there. And this board kind of runs into that, where it's just like the PCIe expansion options kind of suck, as far as I'm concerned. Like, you get 3 full-size 16X slots, and that's it, right? Because you have an M.2 up there, and M.2 over here, and an M.2 down here. So it's like, yeah, if you have a lot of little expansion cards, then you're kind of screwed. Now, luckily, you probably won't need a ton of expansion. Well, I don't know. The thing is, it is you do get 10 gigabit LAN, but it's a Quantia, and you get 1 gig Intel, which is like 1 gig Intel is good. That's nice. 10 gig of Quantia, I don't test LAN controllers, and I've heard complaints about 10 gig of Quantia chips. So I don't know. It might just be that whoever had those complaints has some very specific requirements that like Intel fulfills and a Quantia doesn't, or whatever. But yeah, like Intel LAN seems to get the least complaints, so that's kind of that. So you might potentially want like a 10 gig Intel LAN card, and then it's just like, well, there's no 1X slots, so that's kind of awkward. Yeah, so it's kind of that. The rear I/O section is, in my opinion, like, I like the rear I/O. You got a ton of USB ports, which is great. We've got Q-Flash, you've got clear CMOS on the rear I/O. So basically, the rear I/O for me, perfect. Right, and of course, you have the 10 gig and the 1 gig LAN here as well, and Wi-Fi 6. That's such a weird mishmash of features. Like, I feel like the Wi-Fi cards should just be optional accessories. I'd make the boards cheaper for that, but eh. Anyway, board does have a postcode power reset button internal as well. BIOS switches for Gigabyte's dual BIOS system. The board does have dual BIOS, which a lot of boards don't have. Mostly because these days, with so many boards having the BIOS flashback functionality, I assume basically the board vendors are like, hey, if you screw up your BIOS, you can just flash right over it, using the BIOS flashback feature. But I still think, you know, worst case scenario, you somehow break the BIOS chip completely. Having a whole nother physical BIOS chip is just better, right? Especially since it doesn't cost that much to do in the first place. Anyway, audio section. I mean, I don't review audio, so I'm not going to say, like, my personal thoughts on audio is that if you care about audio, you're better off buying a $200 motherboard and a $200 sound card than buying a $700 motherboard to get a better audio section. I think buying the board just for the audio section is kind of silly, which ultimately I feel like honestly, as I've been going through these motherboard PC, like doing these motherboard videos, I just kind of feel like, look, a lot of the things that you pay extra for on a motherboard should just be optional add-in cards, right? Like, what do we have PCIe for? Like, what do you think PCIe is for, right? It's like, you have PCIe slots, use them. Especially since sound cards often work off of 1X, right? And there's plenty of 1X to go around. It's like 16X and 8X and 4X are the ones that come at a premium as far as I'm concerned. But 1X slots, I mean, you have tons of those. So, yeah, I'm not really, like, still. Looks like the audio section on this is the most expensive audio section Gigabyte puts on their motherboard, which makes sense because it's the $700 board. How good it is, I don't know how to judge that. I'd say you could probably get a sound card that costs significantly less than this motherboard. That's significantly better than this audio section. So, yeah, I feel like honestly, I feel like you'd be better off buying the $350 Master and then buying like a really expensive external sound card, or even an internal sound card, but external ones are generally going to be better, and using that instead. That, I think, and it would still be ultimately like, you know, $350 motherboard, $200 sound card, $550 total versus $700 for this board right here. That's kind of why I think really expensive audio sections on motherboards just don't make that much sense. Because if you have enough USB ports, you can just put a sound card on a USB port. Or if you have a ton of PCIe, you can just put a sound card on a PCIe slot. Or you can also, similarly, you can deal with your LAN, right? Like, if you need more 10 gig connections, you can get like dual 10 gigabit Intel PCIe cards, which I think are around $100. So it's just like a lot of this like super high, like, and the funny thing is the Aquantia LAN chip itself is like $50. Like, that is not a cheap chip. So the fact that it only shows up on like really high-end expensive motherboards makes perfect sense, because, you know, that Aquantia LAN chip on like a $500 motherboard is 10% of the retail price, right? Which is kind of ridiculous. Anyway, so yeah, like this board is just, like, basically, you know, like most extra high-end flagships, it's one of those boards where the vendor just kind of took the very best they could do in any one department, and they just threw it all at one motherboard, and the end result is a motherboard that costs a ton of money. And if you buy it, you're probably not going to use all of the things you just paid for, right? Because I'd assume if you use the LAN, you're not going to be using the Wi-Fi. So you just paid extra for Wi-Fi you're not going to use. And if you use the Wi-Fi, then you're probably not using the 10 gig LAN. So why did you pay $50 for a Quantia 10 gig LAN chip? And it's like, so yeah, that's kind of like, personally, I think motherboards should come with PCIe slots, USB ports, and that's it. Like, everything else is just optional. It is just optional extras that aren't really that necessary. Because you can probably, like, because if you have enough USB ports, you can just add them externally. Or if you have enough PCIe slots, you can just add them as well. But anyway, so overall, like, The funny thing is, in the ultra high end motherboard category, so the versus like the Crosshair 8 formula from Asus, and against the Godlike from MSI, I think the Extreme is the least. Like the thing is, the Crosshair 8 formula, as far as I'm concerned, is just a really overpriced version of the Crosshair 8 Hero, a sort of profit optimized version of the Crosshair 8 Hero. It's way more expensive, and it doesn't really do much more than the regular Hero board. The Godlike, on the other hand, is a motherboard where MSI just kind of, I don't know, like, I have no idea what the goal was with that motherboard, because it's just a mess of random features. And there's a lot of high-end features, but it's a mess overall. Because it does just so much random stuff, but it seems to be really good at memory overclocking, and that, to me, is a highlight with the Godlike. But potentially, because I don't know how, like, Asus's memory overclocking support is going, or how Gigabyte's is, but so far from what I've seen, the Godlike's memory overclocking support looks absolutely insane. Like, MSI's already posted a 5.7 gigahertz DDR4 memory overclock with it. Yeah, so the Godlike is just overall what I consider a $700 blob of expensive stuff. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's just the motherboard doesn't make much sense to me. And the Extreme, I'd argue, suffers from that issue as well, but less so, because you get the very best VRM, which quite frankly is irrelevant. I don't think it makes any difference. If anything, like, if there's any benefit to having this many true phases, you'd have 99.9% of that benefit with the Master. Okay? I'm just going to throw that out there. The Master probably does everything this board does. Now, admittedly, the Master doesn't have quite as efficient a VRM, but you save so much damn money buying that board instead. So that's kind of that. But with this board, so you have the insanely, the audio I still feel like is just a waste of board space, but whatever. Like, some people might be happy that they don't need to buy a better audio solution instead. But this has the 10 gig LAN, and it is actually integrated into the board. It doesn't, use up one of your PCIe slots. And you also have Intel LAN, so that's good. You have the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth integrated into that. This board is basically, like, this one doesn't feel like a random mishmash of features. It just kind of feels like all of the things a motherboard should have, and then the most expensive version of said thing. I still think that's a really massive waste of money, and personally, the only reason why I'd ever consider buying this board is to, like, frame it and put a little label, first consumer motherboard to ever have a 14 plus 2 phase VRM. And that's kind of what I would do with it. But, because practically speaking, there's not much benefit to this board in terms of, like, in practical use. And I didn't even go over the fact that, like, it also uses the, I don't know where they mention it, but this board uses, like, the low loss version. Yeah, so low loss PCB. So basically they have the, which I think, is it higher density glass fiber or whatever? Like, basically you can spend extra money on your PCB substrate to get better signal integrity, which primarily is done for your PCIe 4.0 signal integrity. The thing is, like, Gigabyte isn't really doing anything all that special with their PCIe slots here, so I feel like that's just one of those, well, the competition is doing it, so we should do it too kind of thing. It has 2-ounce copper PCB, which is kind of standard for motherboards from $200 and up. So that's not really anything special. Yeah, the highlights here are, like, it's passive, the VRM's insane. Those are the highlights to me, because yes, the rear IO looks amazing. You have a ton of USB ports, but there's other boards that have a ton of USB ports and cost less, like the Creation from MSI. The Creation also has the 10 gig LAN and the Intel Gigabit. And the main downside to buying a Creation instead of this thing is that you get the biggest difference there is that you have a fan on the chipset and you have a slightly worse VRM. Not to a relevant extent. It's just like, on paper, that VRM is technically worse. And it's just like, well, in practice, you're not going to actually notice that there's a difference. So yeah, this board is just, I don't know, like, like, flagship motherboards just run into this issue, I think, where Like, personally, I feel like it was super expensive flagship boards were easier to justify back in the days when they would come with PLX chips. Because when you came with the PLX chip, it was like, hey, we got 32 PCIe lanes, but you can't do that with PCIe 4.0 as far as I'm aware. Because I've not yet seen a PCIe 4.0 PLX chip, and even if it did exist, it would probably be $200 because the PEX 8747, which is the PCIe 3.0 PLX chip, that one is almost $100 because Broadcom decided to jack up prices after buying the company that makes them. So yeah, that really sucks. Anyway, let's just take a quick look at the QVL for the memory support, which unfortunately this board has a like the QVL list for this motherboard is actually inferior to what you have on the Master, which I don't think is down to the, I think is ultimately because Gigabyte decided, well, nobody's going to buy, like there's very few people going to be buying the $700 board. So we're going to QVL all like as much memory for the actually popular board, the Master. Right, so the result is that the QVL for this board is not better than what you get for the Master. But it does go all the way up to 4400, and if you're interested in, yeah, so basically, they did, like, for the Master, they actually have some of the 4400 megahertz kits validated at 4 DIMMs population, and here it's just like, they did, I assume they just didn't test it yet. But they do have 4000 megahertz validated on Micron eDie for 4 DIMMs, and that's 4 by 8 gigabytes, so 32 gigabytes total. And if we scroll down, if you want 64 gigabytes of memory, they do, I believe they have a QVL for like 3733 or 3600, something like that. Unfortunately, their QVL list is just a PDF and not nearly as convenient to search through as some of the, like, say, MSI's QVL, where you can actually just, like, sort it by speed and then density. No. Nope. Oh, there we go. That's, wait, Nanya? This stuff is, what? No, that's 8 gigs. Yeah. Okay, well, this QVL is awkward to search through. Oh, there we go. 60. Nope, that still sucks. Well, whatever. So, yeah, the QVL for this thing isn't particularly impressive considering the insane price point, but yeah, that's the extreme for you. Anyway, next, X570 Horas Master. So this board, I think, like, Gigabyte put far more attention into this one because this one's the one that people will actually buy. This one, I'm like, this one exists to go like, hey, look, we can build insane motherboards. And yet, yes, you can, Gigabyte. Yes, you can. You can also charge insane prices for them. And this is the one this is the one we think people will actually buy because, quite frankly, who wants to who wants to spend $700 on a motherboard? So with this board unfortunately lands into the $360 price range where basically all of the motherboards are the same and they cost the same and everything is the same. But the Master does have a few edges over some of the other motherboards I've looked at so far. So first of all, it has the best, like, as far as I can tell, it has basically the best M.2 SSD support. So you have the 2 full-length M.2 slots like there, and then you also have the shorter length slot over here. And as far as I know, this is the, like, I think ASRock is the only ones who have this same configuration, because MSI does do 3 M.2 slots, but they're not they have like 2 short ones and 1 long one. I'm not going to remember the standard for M.2s. I don't care about them that much. So we're just going to refer to them as long and short. But yeah, so Gigabyte has 2 long ones and 1 short one. Asus only has 2 M.2 slots. And MSI, while they do have 3 M.2 slots, only has 4 SATA ports. So, which ultimately isn't really that much of an issue, because if you are using 3 M.2 devices, like if you do populate all 3 M.2 slots, you actually lose a set of SATA ports because they're hooked up. Like you can use them as M.2 or you can use them as SATA ports. That's kind of that, the way the chipset is configured. But ultimately, yeah, like, so that's one, like, slightly better expansion flexibility with this board. The VRM on this board is actually, on raw power capability, worse than what you get on a lot of the other motherboards at $350, because this is on 1250 amp power stages, while everybody else is on, like, 60 amp power stages, with a roughly similar number of them. So, yeah, you know, this ends up being slightly inferior in the raw power delivery capabilities. but not really a big deal as far as I'm concerned. Like, honestly, it's another one of those, the difference, like, there's not really going to be any difference as far as I'm concerned in that. You do get a postcode, you get a power button, you get a reset button, you get the clear CMOS in the rear IO, you get your power, clear CMOS and BIOS flashback in the rear IO. Good set of USB ports. I mean, I'd prefer a taller, like, I'd prefer, if this was a full stack as well of USB ports, but hey, I can live with just, how many is it? That's 4, 2, 8, almost, well, 9. I don't count the Type C. Like, the only Type C device I have is a phone. That doesn't count. So, and that one's charging cable ends in a regular USB, which I can't remember. Is it Type A? I think it's Type A. So, anyway, but rear IO looks good. You get your Wi-Fi, you get 2.5 gig Realtek, you get 1 gig Intel as well. Oh, well, that's the 1 gig, that's the 2.5 gig. And the 2.5 gig is also standard across all of the motherboards at this price point as well. So, it's just like everybody has that too. So that's not really a differentiating feature. So really, so far, for like, I've already, so looking through this motherboard before, the main difference the main highlight to me with this board is not so much the raw specs, because on the raw specs, it's basically the same as everything else in this price range. But what is kind of interesting about this board is the memory QVL. Assuming that it's actually, like, the thing is, some of the QVLs are more optimistic than others. But if this one is not lying, or if this is realistic for a lot of CPUs, then this is the highest 32 gig QVL I've seen. 4400 megahertz on 32 gigs of RAM in the QVL. Like, this is the first QVL I've seen with a spec like this. And that's actually impressive. And the interesting thing is, this motherboard actually has a daisy chain memory layout, which, this is something that I suspected would kind of happen, because I know a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to buy an ASRock motherboard because it has T-topology. But the thing about T-topology is T-topology just kind of tries to fix a shortcoming from the memory controller side of the fact that when you have a daisy chain, you basically have a timing problem because some of the DIMMs are closer to the CPU than the other DIMMs. On a T-topology board, that isn't an issue. But the memory controller, if if the memory controller is configured well enough, could potentially compensate for that kind of timing problem. And that seems to be the case, considering that Gigabyte is getting 40, if this is accurate, like, they're getting 4400 megahertz to work on daisy chain on 4 DIMMs. You don't need a T-topology. You just need a good BIOS and a well set up daisy chain topology, and you're going to be doing, the same speeds as everybody else, apparently. So that actually makes me wonder if they just haven't. Also, the fact that they're doing 4400 on apparently 4 DIMMs makes me wonder if, hey, did they not bother to test 4600 or 4800? Because you would assume that, with less load on the memory controller, they'd be able to hit higher memory speeds. So, yeah, but this board, like, for 32 gigs of RAM, like, they've validated 4266 and 4133. For comparison, the highest QVL that I've, the highest validation I've seen from a lot of other board vendors for 4 sticks is like 4000 megahertz. On Gigabyte also has that kit in here somewhere. Where is it? Oh, right, they're ballistics. There, that one right here. So this kit right here also does 4000 on a lot of motherboards, in 4 DIMM configuration. But Gigabyte has QVL'd all the way up to 4400. So I would assume even 4133 is the one I would assume is going to be actually reliable, because I don't trust the QVLs that much. It's like, if they qualify QVL 4400, then just assume that 2 ticks down is what's going to actually be viable. So that would be 4133. But yeah, they just, like, for 32 gig configurations, that's just basically filled out. Right? Like, the side right here is just filled out. From 4000 down, it's just like, yeah, and that's really impressive. So if this is accurate, that is awesome. Now, I would assume most of the other motherboards are also probably capable of No, you can't. You can never assume that, right? Because it might be that Gigabyte is doing something special with their daisy chain that nobody else is doing, and it's just like, and maybe their daisy chain is a little bit like, I don't know. So Gigabyte's daisy chain might be just such a very special daisy chain that it does this, and everybody else's stops at like 4,000 or something. Or doesn't, or it's just a matter of everybody else not getting through to the testing of this many 32 gig configuration. That's also a possibility. Right. But yeah, like honestly, if this QVL is accurate, that's awesome. That's really, really awesome that they're getting 4400. And that, to me, that's a highlight with this motherboard. It also makes me wonder if the QVL for the Extreme is incomplete, considering that this one seems to be much more filled out in terms of things that apparently work. Though the Extreme should be on a different memory layout because this is an 8-layer PCB and this is a 6-layer. But an 8-layer, if anything, should have even better memory support than a 6-layer, unless something got screwed up in the process for the 8-layer. Right? Like, that's one of those things, is just like, just because you have more, like, just because you could do it better doesn't necessarily mean it is better. And they could also, like, if you have an 8-layer board, there's nothing stopping you from just taking a 6-layer layout and sticking it into an 8-layer design, right? Like, that also is an option. So they could actually completely share designs. Yeah, the QVL for the Master is just absolutely, like, it's really impressive to the point where I'm like, I'm not sure I even trust some of this, like that one right there. Like, this one is just like, really? But if this is accurate, that is seriously impressive. And yeah, I guess I'll have to try test this out, because this looks great as far as I'm concerned, right? Like, this looks absolutely incredible. Anyway, so other things about the Master. So we went over the rear IO, and basically at 300, like, it's a solid board. And the highlight for me is the memory QVL, which, interestingly enough, Gigabyte didn't seem to bother to validate like super high speed kits, which I think the other reason why they're not bothering with like 4800 megahertz is that how many people do you know of that are going to buy a $500 or $600 or $700 16 gigabyte memory kit? Because that's all the, like, the 4800 megahertz CL18 memory kits, they're all around like $500 to $600, $700. They're insanely expensive. So it kind of makes sense that, if you're like, I mean, the board might support them, but like, how many people care about them actually being supported, right? That's the other question. So it might just be a waste of time to bother. But yeah, still, like, this is potentially, like, assuming that everything else is, like, if we assume that there's nothing wrong with the BIOS and that QVL is not lying, then this could very easily be... Well, the thing is, the other boards are also really good at this price point, but I don't know. I'd have to see the BIOS. Like, at $350, I'd have to see the BIOS, but that QVL right there is just like, if this Gigabyte could very well have an advantage with this, and that would be like, awesome for them. And that alone would sell me on this board, because it's just like, yeah, if you want to run, which I think, like, a lot of people would, I'd assume, want to run a 12-core or a 16-core CPU with 32 gigs of RAM, and it's just like, well, here's your board. This is your board. Because I've not seen a QVL go this high yet for that configuration. Anyway, so moving on from the Master to the Ultra. And the Ultra is so the Ultra takes the heatsink of the Master and whacks it on the VRM of the Pro, and basically also adds the M.2 configuration. That's, like, the Ultra looks a lot like the Master, but it's mostly based on the PCB of the Pro. So, it's not a similar board. Also, you'll notice that it is on different capacitors. These are APAC capacitors instead of Nichicons. This board's $300, and for $300, I'm actually annoyed with a couple things. So we have a Q flash button, but there's no postcode. You just have LEDs, which is just like, well, let's just put it this way. ASRock has a $300 motherboard with a power button, reset button, postcode, clear CMOS internally, clear CMOS on rear I/O, BIOS flashback on rear I/O, and, well, basically everything. Also the same M.2 configuration and 6 SATA ports. I mean, even 8 SATA ports, like the Tai Chi. Like, at the $300 price point, I ultimately think the Tai Chi, like, assuming ASRock hasn't screwed up their BIOS, I think at $300, the only answer is the Tai Chi. That board just flattens that entire area because nothing else has the same feature set. But still, what I do wonder about is like this board could be on the same exact memory layout as the master because it's still, as far as I know, it's still on the same layer count. So let's check out that QVL. Also, the rear I/O on this board is kind of stripped down at this point. But let's check out the QVL. Yup. Yeah, that's okay. So this seems to be the exact same memory layout as the master. I assume that they didn't test the extreme very much then. Yeah, you can see how just the four stick support column is full, really full, which that's awesome. So yeah, that's really cool. So that should mean, because I'd assume, so that should work all the way down to the Pro or the Pro Wi-Fi. So let's check that. Like there could also be a mistake always, right, with the QVLs, but yeah, no, it is the same. Yeah, to me it makes sense that they're on the same memory layout. So if you have the same memory layout and the same memory VRM, right? Like everything about the memory section on these boards is identical. It's just like, yeah, it makes sense that your QVL is going to be identical because the traces are identical, the power delivery is identical, everything's the same. Why would the QVL change? So, yeah, that is, that's impressive. I'm just trying to check. Yeah, no. So the thing is, I was just wondering if like maybe they're not doing the ASRock thing where they'll support a memory kit and then it'll be like, oh, it's supported at 200 megahertz below spec. But I can't see any kit that seems to be doing that in here. So yeah, I guess if they're filled out, it means it's filled out. Like it works. So that's awesome though. That's really awesome. So the thing about the Ultra is actually VRM wise, it has the same VRM that you'd get on like a Z390 Horas Master, which I mean, we all know that VRM handles a 9900K just fine. It actually has the same heatsink as what you'd get on a Z390 Horas Master. So yeah, the main difference from a Z390 Horas Master is that the capacitors are APACs, but the thing is the VRM runs this VRM runs cool, and 3900Xs are actually lighter loads than 9900Ks are. So this VRM is going to be running even cooler than it normally does, and it really didn't have an issue with 9900Ks whatsoever. So I wouldn't worry about the fact these basically APAC is a Taiwanese cap maker, whereas a lot of the other boards in this price range are already on Nichicons, but it's just like, well, doesn't make a difference because the caps aren't running at 105 degrees, and they're rated for the same thing anyway, so unless there's a major difference in how Nichicon does their specs and APAC does their specs, you won't really see much of a difference. Plus, these are aluminum polymers. They don't do catastrophic failure as a well, no, you can get them to do catastrophic failure modes, but generally speaking, they don't do that under, wear out, okay? If you wear them out, they're not going to blow up on you or something. They're basically going to stop being capacitors. So they'll fail open, and it'll be like your after X thousand hours, it'll be like a couple of your capacitors went missing. That's basically what it'll behave like, right? So, yeah. And that's really that might lead to slightly worse overclocks after several years, but really not a huge deal and not something I would be too worried about, especially since the VRM is going to be running really cool. So, anyway, yeah, the main thing I like, the rear I/O, actually, no, they did keep a decent amount of USB ports. They have this 4-stack over here. So yeah, decent amount of USB. You still get Intel Gig LAN. You get your BIOS flashback. You even have an HDMI output if you wanted to put an APU on this for some ungodly reason. For an APU, the VRM is actually really imbalanced. You have the SoC VRM is not very nice compared to the vCore. So I wouldn't run an APU on this for that reason. It's not that it would have a problem. It's just that I would, there's motherboards I can think of that I'd rather power my APU with, like a Strix E, which is really, really expensive and overkill for an APU, but that is probably currently one of the, well, that's probably the best VRM you can get for SoC power. Anyway, so yeah, Gigabyte's QVL is nuts. We already know that. Yeah, Intel GigaLAN, which I'm a fan of. You get Wi-Fi with this. The main issue I have with this board is just, for $300 you don't even get a postcode. I feel like if Gigabyte if Gigabyte had a postcode on the Pro and the Ultra and all of these boards, then I'd be like, yeah, sure, get the Ultra. Sure, it doesn't have a power button, but you can, like, the power button is not as, like, it's not as critical, right? You can always get a power button of your own. If you need a power button that much, you can add that yourself. It's not that hard. And if you need a postcode, it's not like, well, you can buy poster cards, but they're kind of a pain to find. So that's one of those things. And I honestly, again, it's one of those things where it's just like, but it's also using up a PCIe slot or potentially one of your, like, that gets awkward. It's better if the postcode's, in my opinion, already in the motherboard. It's kind of like LAN, right? You can get LAN cards, but I feel like the motherboard should already offer a very reliable LAN solution of its own, so that until you have your LAN card up and running, you have your expansion card up and running, you can at least work with the networking that the motherboard came with, right? Like that's kind of the requirement, is just like the motherboard needs to offer a good starting point to build a system on top of. Anyway, so yeah, the Ultra, really not that bad. Now, if we look at the Pro, I feel like the thing with the Ultra is just like, you could just get a Pro instead. Yeah, you could. And the Pro does have a Wi-Fi option, so if you want Wi-Fi 6, there is... Oh no, I did the... Oh no, it's still fine. Cool. So the Pro does have a Wi-Fi option, and the Wi-Fi option of the Pro is 269, whereas the non-Wi-Fi option of the Pro is, where is it? It's not on Newegg, really? Should be 259. It should be like $10 or $20 difference between the Wi-Fi version and the non-Wi-Fi version. So at that point, it's just like, I don't know. Well, it's not a big deal. Price-wise. So technically the Pro Wi-Fi is going right up against the Asus X570-Pro motherboard, both in terms of feature set and price point, except this has, like, the thing is, this has Wi-Fi, and the Dash Pro from Asus doesn't have Wi-Fi. So to me, this is the clear winner at that point, because you just get more stuff, right? You just get more, you get Wi-Fi, you get the same, I think actually this wins on USB ports as well. The VRM, I would consider it I'd consider it equivalent. The debug capabilities, this has 4 LEDs. The Pros has 4 LEDs. They're admittedly color-coded on the Dash Pro from Asus has 4 LEDs. They're color-coded, but quite frankly, Gigabyte doesn't put their 4 LEDs in a line. So it's not quite so hard to figure out which one's lighting up as on some other motherboards. Yeah, so honestly, it's like this board is just like, it's I'd say it's relatively well balanced. At the same time, though, you do have the Elite. And the thing about the Elite is that it has the same rear I/O section, except there's no option for a Wi-Fi version of the Elite. It does change the VRM. So the VRM, instead of being 12 phases of international rectifier, this is 12 phases of intersil. You still have APAC capacitors, still 5,000 hours rated. The thing about the intersil VR, technically speaking, both intersil and international rectifier offer some crazy transient response optimization features in their digital controllers. And this board uses a digital intersil controller. The funny thing is like EVGA likes intersil for their ultra high-end boards, and then you have all the other board vendors seem to use intersil for like their low end, which is just kind of interesting to me. Is just like, I don't know, does like EVGA have access to stuff other people don't? Or like, why is this? I'm not sure. Ultimately, the thing is, so, and the thing about this VRM though is it does use technically 50 amp DR MOS power stages instead of the POW IR 40 amp POW IR stages that this gets. So on paper, this VRM is actually technically less powerful than the VRM on here. But I've talked to Gigabyte about this, and you know they've presented me with like test results that they did internally, and this VRM ultimately runs slightly hotter than the VRM that they have on the Pro. And that's without any heatsinks installed on a motherboard with the same PCB layer, like same layer count, same style PCB, same everything. Like they did a test where it's just like, yes, the test methodology is completely valid. This VRM runs a couple degrees warmer. Fair. It might be to do with some kind of power optimization thing. I don't know. Okay. But ultimately in Gigabyte's testing, this runs a bit warmer. And the funny thing is, this VRM, you might be like, oh, Gigabyte's just being cheap using 40 amp POW IR stages on their Horas Pro Wi-Fi instead of the 50 amp intersills. The thing is, as far as I know, the 40 amp POW IR stages are more expensive than the intersill 50 amps because these are dumb. Like the POW IR stages integrate a whole bunch of extra functionality in the form of like temperature monitoring, current monitoring, and some extra like transient response optimization features. Whereas this VRM is just like, they switch on and off, and that's it. That's all they do. You feed them a PWM signal, and they turn 12 volts on and off at the rate of the PWM signal. That's all the functionality that the SIC 634s on here have. And so these are dumb as bricks. And they're also really cheap because of that. They're like $1 a piece, whereas as far as I know, the 3553s are about like $2 or $3. So this VRM does cost more, even though on paper it's supposed to be like, and on paper it sounds like it should be inferior, but evidently it runs cooler somehow. And yeah, it ultimately works out better than these power stages, and that's why Gigabyte uses the 40 amp international rectifier power stages on their higher end boards rather than the 50 amp intersill DR MOS, because like these are technically, like these are still a type of power stage. It's just that it's a dumb power stage, so that's why they're so cheap. Anyway, but the thing is, ultimately, I don't think that makes that much of a difference in the VRM department. What will make a bigger difference in your VRM thermals is the heatsink on this board compared to the heatsink on this board. As you can clearly see, this one has a lot more in the way of surface area. In fact, honestly, I actually love the look of this board. Well, if we covered up the bottom half. The top half of this board, I love the look of it. Right, so you have a lot of like surface area on that heatsink, and yeah, so the heatsink on this looks a lot better than the heatsink on this, right? Like, so that's kind of the main thing with these two boards. But still, this VRM should have no problem handling a 3900X or even a 3950X under like Prime 95 small FFTs, just, you know, wailing away at it with AVX. The board should have no problem handling that. And the things you lose compared to the Pro Wi-Fi. So first of all, the Pro Wi-Fi gives you a CPU slot 1, CPU slot 2, right? And then a PCIe. So you have 16, 8, 4. And if you want to use all the slots, you get 8, 8, 4. This is 16 and 4. This is off of the chipset. That's one of the big losses with this motherboard is just, yeah, you lose the... you lose the PCIe from you lose the extra CPU PCIe slot, which potentially for some people, like I have a capture card, which absolutely doesn't work if you stick it in a chipset PCIe slot. So for me, that's a huge deal. If you're a normal user, you probably don't have a really picky capture card to deal with, so you don't have to worry about that, right? But if you do, then yeah, you'd kind of have to go to the Pro. And honestly, at the $260 price point, like, you know, at 270, around 250, this board, it's not bad. And if you get the non-Wi-Fi version, you actually save a bit of money, right? For $259 or $249, like, yeah. So that's kind of that. But the Elite, I think, if you're just trying to throw together a basic gaming system with like a 3900, like not even a 39. Well, the thing is, if you're buying a 3800X, I'd tell you to go straight down to like a B450 board from MSI or a 3700X. And actually, in that case, you could actually even go like Asus B450 boards, MSI B450s, Asus B450s, or MSI or Asus X470 boards would also be options. for those two CPUs, because they're so low power relative to what you like to even a 2700X. Like they pull less power than a 2700X, even if you even if you run them overclocked with the maximum amount of safe voltage, they pull less power than a 2700X. Under Prime 95 with AVX and all of that. Like they're more efficient. They're 7 nanometer. They pull less power. Isn't that great? So yeah, but the Elite, I think if you're building like, I guess, an entry level 3900X base build, whatever, why ever that exists, I don't like. Weird use scenario in my opinion. Maybe, I guess, entry level like 3D rendering workstation or something like that. I don't know. All I do is record videos and post them to YouTube without even editing them. So, I don't really have workstation needs, but I do want to see the QVL because this motherboard I know for a fact uses a different PCB. And yeah, it shows. Though, that is still impressive. Like, that is still impressive that they're still doing 3866 on that. That's not as, like, it could have been a lot worse. And they only do 4,000 on 2 sticks. Like, this looks like a QVL for a T topology with a bad memory controller, except I know for a fact that this board is daisy chain. So, yeah, I wonder if they didn't bother to test higher spec kits, or if they could be sandbagging the QVL as well, I guess. But still, like, they support well into the sweet spot for Ryzen performance, right? If you're running 1-to-1 memory to fabric clock, you're only going to go up to like 3866 or 3733, and well, actually not even 3866. You're going to stop at like 3733 or 3800-ish. And the board supports 32 gigs up to that on certain kits, and you have a 3733 option for 32 gigs of RAM. Don't you? Yeah. So, yeah, I'd say this QVL looks quite, like, yeah, you don't have some super high speed options available, but I personally always find that it's just like your memory performance sweet spot is going to be around 3600 to 4000 megahertz, depending on the platform. Past that, you start running into things like with Z390. If you start going past 4000 megahertz, you start running into like, does my memory controller suck? Does my motherboard suck? And with actually on Z390, even at like 3600, you can run into does my motherboard suck? And with like Ryzen, I feel like, well, once you hit 3733, that's where you should just stop, right? Unless you're doing unless you're going for like frequency validation records. But that's like a completely, like, that's not what this board is meant for, even remotely. So yeah, the Elite is just, and the thing is, it still keeps Intel LAN. So it's just, to me, this board just seems way too good, right? Because you have the same rear I/O as a Pro Wi-Fi. You get the same rear I/O as a Pro. You get a slightly worse VRM than a Pro. You get slightly worse VRM heatsinks than a Pro. But quite frankly, they're not bad enough to really cause any issues. You get the same, like, you still have Intel LAN. Like, rear I/O is unchanged. You get slightly worse memory support, but it's not bad enough to be a concern as far as I'm concerned. What else? Like, oh, you still have the same number of USB M.2 slots. You still have the same number of SATA. You still have the oh yeah, I remembered what you lose. You do lose the troubleshooting LEDs. There's absolutely no troubleshooting anything on this motherboard. No postcode, and not even the 4 LEDs to tell you which part of your system failed. So if you're not getting a display output out of this motherboard, like, it's just that much harder to tell why. Right? Because no display could be like, it could be like, oh, I didn't plug in my power cables for the GPU, which is one of those things your motherboard will tell you about, right? Or you have a memory issue, your motherboard can tell you about that. But the thing is like, if your system doesn't power, like, you press the power button and you get a black screen, it can be anything from, you forgot to plug in the display cable into the GPU, to your CPU died. Right? And if you have no troubleshooting features whatsoever, that just kind of sucks. And somebody's going to be like, Buildzoid, the speaker exists. I don't like things beeping at me. I'm sorry, but I don't. But admittedly, yeah, you do still have the speaker, but the speaker does exist. But I would honestly, like, it's 4 LEDs. They can't cost that much. Though I do admit that if this had LEDs, then, like, the question of why you would ever buy the Pro becomes a very major concern. Is like, and honestly, buying the Pro for the 4 LEDs, like, I feel like you're buying the Pro for the extra PCIe slot and the LEDs. That's, like, the two things that really, and maybe the Wi-Fi. Right. Whereas with this board, it's just like this board at $200 just kind of makes everything about, like, if this had a postcode, honestly, everything above this board would just make no sense at all as far as I'm concerned. Like, it would just be like, why would you buy anything other than this? What more could you possibly bloody need? It's got USB ports. It's got Intel LAN. It's got, like, you know, for your basic PCIe expansion options, you got that. It's got decent memory support. Like, what more could you possibly want from your bloody board? So yeah, I'm a big fan of the Elite. I'm a really big fan of the Elite. Like, solid board, at least assuming everything Gigabyte claims about it is correct, and assuming that Gigabyte doesn't do something wrong with the BIOS. Anyway, X570i Aorus Pro, the ITX option. Surprisingly, not insanely expensive. $220, which is kind of a lot for an ITX board, but it could be a lot worse, especially considering that Gigabyte is throwing freaking 70 amp power stages into this from Infineon. Those are really expensive. Those are the same power stages you get on the Extreme, except there's 6 of them here, which does make this the most powerful. No, the Crosshair 8 Impact technically has a more powerful VRM, but this has more phases. How that works is a story for another video. But this VRM right here should already be just more than enough for even like a 3950X overclocked. And yeah, like, I don't know. Arguably, and I'm pretty sure the Crosshair 8 Impact is going to be way more expensive than this. So, and also that board is DTX, not ITX, and I've seen a lot of people be concerned about that. Like, if you want an ITX board, I don't see why you wouldn't. Like, I can't see any major problem that would stop me from buying this board right here, right? We have an 8-layer PCB. This is the funny thing about ITX boards, is just because they're so small, they're actually more expensive to produce than a lot of the other boards, because you need more layers to accommodate all the functionality on them. You need better VRMs because there's not enough space for giant elaborate heatsinks, so you need as much VRM efficiency as you can get so that you don't need a giant heatsink to stop it from overheating. Right, and then you sometimes have to get creative with with doing really much of anything, and you can't recycle as many parts of this motherboard as well, right? Like, this has a completely unique VRM design, as far as I know. Like, Gigabyte's never used this VRM design, whereas the VRM design on the Elite is recycled off of some of the Z390 boards, and the VRM on the Pro is also recycled off of the Z390 Master. So this board is just like ITX boards are just like expensive to produce as a result, but the price really here, like, it's only a little bit more than the Elite. And what I really wonder about is, since it's 2 DIMM slots, does it kill it on memory overclocking? Because it could. But I'm not sure, like, maybe this QVL is even worse than the one they have for the Extreme, where it's just like, oh, we didn't bother to test anything. Oh no, it just stops at 4400. Oh, that's kind of sad. Oh wait, no, this one seems to have more 4400 kits validated than well, aren't those like all the same thing? Yeah, those are the same thing over and over again. Why would you bother listing that? That's useless. Okay, well, yeah, but it is validated for 4400. Wait, why 1? Okay, and of course just 2 for this. Well, that makes 0 bloody sense, doesn't it? So, yeah, that's a bit of a mess. Anyway, what else do we have here? I wonder, like, can it run 32 gigs of RAM? And how well... Oh, it can run 32 gigs of RAM up to 3866. Nice. That's nice. Oh, wait, they can do 4000 on... No. Wait, what? Okay, wait. Now, that is really confusing. I feel like that should be a mistake. Like, how do you have that work? Is one DIMM slot on this motherboard just completely botched in terms of trace layout? Like it's possible that like one of the DIMM slots is just completely just barely, like, because of where it is, it's just screwed up, and it's just like, oh no. Because that's what that looks like to me. Like, wait, why can you run? Why would you be able to do 4,000 on one stick of 16 gigs, but not on two? Like, they're on separate channels. So, like, the only logical conclusion to me there is that one of those channels has a signal integrity problem, and it's the second one. And that's why you can't do 4,000 on two 16 gig sticks. Okay, well, or somebody made a mistake when doing this QVL. That's the other option that I can think of. Anyway, also, I want to see, there should be 32 gig DIMMs listed on here, but they should be just like Samsung generic. So those are like 2666. Team, no. Let's see. 32 gig DIMMs exist, so they should be... No. Damn it, guys. Oh, so they don't have any 32 gig DIMMs on the QVL. Well, that's stupid. I guess it's because you can technically buy 32 gig UDIMMs right now, and they work with a 2700X. They don't overclock particularly well, but they do work. So yeah, well, I do intend to get my hands on the ITX board and the Extreme from Gigabyte, so I'll be testing both of those boards. And at this point, I'm kind of thinking I'd want to test the Master or the Pro, like one of the other boards as well. No, here's the thing is, like, if I request 3 motherboards, the probability that I'll actually make 3 different videos about all those boards is very low. Like, it's kind of the issue. It's just like, as much as I'm like, oh, I'm interested in if this works, but am I actually going to test that myself? Probably not, because it's a lot of work. And like I have other projects running, like, you know, I like to mess around with ancient irrelevant GPUs that nobody cares about. And that kind of thing. And it's just like, yeah, so, you know, asking for a pile of motherboards is not exactly a good, like, it's just not going to lead to much of anything happening with them. It's kind of a waste of motherboards as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, this does have BIOS flashback. Actually, the Gigabyte's entire motherboard lineup has BIOS flashback. The USB, yeah, see, this is the problem with ITX, in my opinion. It's just like, so keyboard, mouse, webcam, sound card, printer. You're screwed. Well, I'd be screwed because I have 2 webcams, I have 1 sound card, a printer. What else is there? Keyboard, mouse. Oh, I have a pass-through on the keyboard because I like for USB sticks and that kind of thing. So yeah, I'd be really screwed with that. Also, you only have 3 audio, like three jacks for audio. And yeah, this is the thing with ITX boards. There's just no space on them. So you end up like, you just can't put that many rear IO things. I wonder if there's any other ITX, like, I wonder if there's an ITX board that actually solves that better. Because the thing about ITX boards also is, like, you only have 1 USB 3.0 internal port. So it's not like you can just, you know, plug into, like for ATX boards, if you have 2 internal USB 3.0s, you can just you can just use those for more USB ports. But here it's just like, well, no, you get 1. There's nothing on the rear IO either. So yeah, except, you know, I guess ITX, people who build ITX system, I assume, are used to just not having things, right? Like PCIe slots, extra power connectors, which you don't need, right? Like, it is a single 8-pin, that's fine. You know, SATA ports, don't have those either. Can't have more than 4. Good temperatures, can't have those in small systems either. I'm joking. You can have good temperatures, right? But still, it's just like, yeah, I could not live with a motherboard that has this few USB ports. So, yeah. Also, like, oh man, like, I would really love to mess around with like overclocking and APU in this. But that QVL, that QVL on this board is the like I hope that 16 gig stick is a mistake and not an indication of like, hey, one of these DIMM slots is vastly inferior to the other. Which like that is totally possible, right? Because if you think about it, you have to like, sure, the board is 8 layers, but you have to cram everything that you'd normally stick into an ATX board into a motherboard that's what? It's 17 by 17 centimeters, I think, or something like that. Like that's barely bigger than a 120 millimeter fan. Is what I always remember. Is just like, yeah, an ITX board is basically as big as some of the fans I use. So, yeah, it's kind of, I mean, it's an ITX board, so it has the usual ITX compromises, but inherently there's like build quality wise, there's no real issues with the board. It's just like, I don't like ITX because, well, I don't know, maybe ASRock or Asus or somebody have an ITX board with more expansion like more USB ports. But yeah, when it comes to build quality, this is fine. I just don't like the rear I/O, but that's mostly down to the fact that it's a little board. So that leaves the Gaming X. Oh boy, this video is over an hour long. Good job, me. I must have repeated myself way too much in this one. Oh well, it's the last one. So after this, it's over. You'll be free to buy motherboards and ignore all of my advice. Anyway, the Gaming X. Gigabyte's cheapest motherboard at $169. And this board, like, let's just go through the first issue I have with it is, of course, the Realtek LAN. Unfortunately, at this price point, you don't really have an option to get anything else but Realtek LAN. If you want Intel LAN for less than $170, you're going to be buying an X470 motherboard or a B450 motherboard. And there's like one B450 motherboard with Intel LAN, which is one thing like, why don't we have B450 motherboards with like a crazy, you know, with like most of the feature set of like a mid-range or high-end X570, right? You save a bunch of money on the chipset. You don't need to build an insane you don't need to build an insane VRM on X570 either. It's just like they kind of do. But I was thinking like take a, you know, build a good VRM, not a crazy one, just a good one. Take the rear I/O off of like a mid-range X570 board. Give it 1 gig LAN. Hell, you could give it even 10 gig LAN, right? Like you could make this crazy mishmash B450 board which integrates 10 gig LAN. Or at least, actually, I'm not sure if the B450 chipset would support that. There might, like, it might be restricted to just one LAN, one onboard LAN controller, but still, it's like, still, you could have like 1 gig Intel, bunch of USB ports, you know, good memory overclocking support, like however many M.2 slots it is that the B450 chipset supports, as many SATA ports as it supports, right? Good VRM, bam, perfect motherboard, and a postcode. Include a postcode. Perfect motherboard. Probably less than 150. I mean, you could probably get that into like $150 price point. And like, yeah, like that would be the best board ever as far as I'm concerned on like cost versus features and performance. Like that would be amazing. Anyway, so yeah, this has Realtek LAN, which I'm not really a fan of. The rear I/O is stripped down, right? I mean, it's cheap, but stripped down. It's almost as bad. It's actually as bad, almost as bad as the ITX board. You have like PS2 port, separate PS2 ports, but I don't see the point in that. And yeah, what else do we get? Like the VRM on this is a 10+2 phase. And with lower RDS on MOSFETs. Well, I guess fair. You could always buy worse MOSFETs, right? There's not really an upper limit for how high the RDS on can be, so you can call it lower. Yeah. So the thing is, like, the good thing about this VRM is it's not going to be as dumb as the one that they have on their low-end X470 and low-end B450 boards. Quite frankly, like, there is so much wrong with the voltage like there's just a bunch of issues with like the Gigabyte B450 and X470 motherboards and like B350 motherboards and X370 motherboards, which aren't necessarily like related to the build quality of the VRM itself, but they are related to the voltage controller that Gigabyte uses. Because I've complained about them to that about certain issues with those boards, and they're like, yeah, we can't do anything about it because the controller is just that bad. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Why did you use it? Why would you use such a controller if it doesn't do even basic functions? And it's just like, well, it was cheap as hell. And it's like, oh. Anyway, yeah, with this board, they're not using that controller anymore, so that's a win. And the VRM is relatively okay, but it's just like at this price point, you can get a better VRM, in my opinion, from the what is it? X570-P from Asus. So, yeah, and you basically get the same rear I/O. The one advantage this has over the Asus motherboard is that this does have BIOS flashback, which the Asus motherboard doesn't have. But both of these boards are just like the rear I/O is stripped down to equal levels on both. And yeah, I just don't like them. I like and this one I like. Arguably, I like this one even less because the VRM, in my opinion, is worse. And, you know, you can do things like buy Intel PCIe LAN cards to solve the fact that this is Realtek. But then it's just like, well, in that case, I may as well buy the board with the better VRM, right? Especially because they cost the same. Though I guess the BIOS flashback is just kind of like the BIOS flashback, I guess, could be a good reason to get this instead. But anyway, let's check out the QVL. I got a sneaking suspicion that the QVL for this thing is going to look the same as what you get on the Elite. Except the Elite has a much better VRM and a much better rear I/O and just, you know, Intel LAN and a whole bunch of advantages like that. And yeah, this is the QVL of the Elite. So yeah, we have that. What is it? No, 3866, right? Don't know why it's so hard to highlight in PDFs. There. So yeah, up to 3866 on 32 gigs of RAM. But this motherboard, like, I feel like you get just such a massive upgrade if you just go with the Elite instead, right? Like, you get way more USB ports. You get a better LAN controller. You get, you don't get any debug features, but you get a better VRM, which is just kind of an added bonus. It's not like this VRM really needs much of an upgrade, but hey, you get an upgrade. Right? Because the main reason I'd get the Elite is the rear I/O and the Intel LAN. Because at $200, this is one of the few boards with the rear I/O that looks the way it does, and the Intel LAN. And that's a huge win in my... Like, to me, that's a huge win. Like, to me, the Intel LAN is, like, super important. Oh, it also upgrades the audio section, but that's, like... The audio is the part of the motherboard I care about the least, because it's just like, well, you could always... You can get, like, you could probably just get, like, a $50 or... Well, I don't know. I guess, you know, I guess if you are stuck using onboard, then the upgrade to the onboard audio isn't a bad thing, but wait, how old is this chip? ALC887. That looks ancient. Then again, I don't pay that much attention to audio, so yeah. Ultimately, like the thing is, I think you just the amount of value, like basically the value peak in the entire X570 lineup is you have two peaks, in my opinion. You have a peak at $200 and another peak at $350. Because at $350 you get into the motherboards that basically have everything, and at $200 you have the motherboards that don't have things that I don't like. For me at least, right? Like you get a good number of USB ports, you have an option to get Wi-Fi, you have an option to get like debug LEDs. You have BIOS flashback. You have Intel LAN. You have all of those things, and basically, the definition of like the perfect $200 board, Gigabyte Elite or the Asus Tough Gaming, with Wi-Fi. Right? If you want Wi-Fi, you get the Tough Gaming from Asus. If you don't want Wi-Fi, you get the Elite from Gigabyte. That's basically my solution to that, to the $200 price point. And then you know, the Pro can kind of justify its existence, right? Because you get the troubleshooting LEDs, you get the M.2, you get M.2, you got the extra PCIe slot, but I feel like this should have had a postcode. Like, if the Pro had a postcode, then it would be just such a big jump from the, like, for troubleshooting, it would be such a big jump from the Elite. But, yeah. And the Master, like, it's obvious, like, Gigabyte wants to sell the Master. That's the board they really want to move a lot of units of. And then some of these boards are kind of filler boards. Like, the Ultra is a filler board. Because it doesn't really make a lot of sense in terms of feature set. Though it is significantly cheaper than the Master, so I guess that's better than like Asus, where they have the Strix E and the Crosshair, and they're like $30 apart, and it's just like, guys, why? Why do these two boards that where one of them just absolutely crushes the other? Why is there only $30 of price gap between them? But yeah, anyway, so that's it for the Gigabyte motherboard walkthrough. The Extreme is extreme and is an extreme of excess, right? It's just like the very most expensive everything that Gigabyte could get their hands on thrown onto one motherboard, leading to a price tag of $700. And you know what? I'm actually kind of wondering if Gigabyte wouldn't have gone with a lower price tag if it weren't for the fact that both MSI, Asus, and both MSI and Asus have $700 flagships. Because I was earlier, like, I heard a price point around Computex that was actually $599. Like, I heard that this board was going to be $599, and then later I got updated that, hey, it's going to be $699. And it's just like, and I assume that happened because basically Asus and MSI lost their bloody mind, where Asus was like, we're going to do, like, MSI was approaching $800 on their MSRP, and Asus was doing $700, and Gigabyte was like, well, the Asus board is just bad, as far as I'm concerned. For that price point, the feature set sucks. And the MSI board is this weird mishmash of, like, stuff that doesn't make a ton of sense. And Gigabyte was like, well, we can do that too. Except we already do that. We'll just raise the price maybe $100. So I think that might have happened. But yeah, like, of the insane $700 motherboards, I find the Extreme the least silly. Because the Formula is just an overpriced hero, and the Godlike is a mess. Like, because, like, I feel like the Godlike is honestly inferior to the Creation in a lot of ways, and at the same, and so it's just like, I don't know. It's just a lot of things about the Godlike I really don't like, and that's why I consider it kind of a mess of a motherboard, because it has a lot of cool ideas, and then none of them are, and it feels like none of them are really finished or fleshed out. So anyway, Extreme, probably the best $700 motherboard, but the $700 motherboards don't make sense in the first place. So, you know, do with that information what you will. Master, very, like, the QVL for this board looks really, like, interesting if it's actually accurate, and you can run 32 gigs of RAM at 4400 megahertz. That's insane. And in terms of feature set, the Master just matches everything else at the similar price point. So, you know, there's nothing really wrong with it. Arguably, in the storage configuration, it has a bit of an advantage. And then the other highlight board for me is the Elite, because it's just so good value for money. Like, you get a ton of USB, you get your Intel LAN, you pay $200, you get basically everything you could ever want from a motherboard, and it's still X570. And then if you need SLI support and maybe a little bit more features, you can get the Pro Wi-Fi. All right. Like, Gigabyte's motherboard stack, honestly, is probably one of the more sensible ones. It's not like Asus, where they're, like, strategically chopping features off here and there, right? Because, like, Asus, if you want Wi-Fi 6, you're going to be paying for a $300 board. Or no, a $330 board or something stupid like that. And then with Gigabyte, they're like, yeah, here's your Wi-Fi option, right? Like, they just kind of stack features up, because it's just like from the bottom, right? With the Gaming X, you get basically nothing. All of the bare minimum is fully fulfilled, in my opinion, on the Elite. Then they're like, and what if you wanted some extra PCIe and Wi-Fi? You get your Pro. What if you wanted more M.2 and a better VRM cooling system? You get your Ultra, right? And it still keeps the Wi-Fi. Like, they've basically just added things from the, like, they took the Pro and just added things to the Pro. And then from the Ultra to the Master, it's just like, okay, so we keep the same heatsinks, but now we upgrade the VRM and we give more overclocking features. And then the extreme is like, well, we turn everything on the motherboard, we turn it up to 11, and you get the extreme. That's kind of the Gigabyte motherboard stack, which in my opinion is the most reasonable one out of all of them, because some of the other board vendors, it's just like they're playing 4D chess with their motherboards, and it doesn't make any sense. Especially like ASRock has motherboards where they're like feature parity, but different price points for no apparent reason. And Asus has motherboards where it's just like, oh, this motherboard has Wi-Fi, but the motherboard that costs more than that doesn't have Wi-Fi because we don't want you. Because, yeah, basically it's like, oh, but if you want Intel LAN, you can't also have Wi-Fi. That would be too much value per dollar. That would be too much value in that product in one go. That would not be okay. So anyway, that is actually it for this video. So thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe. Leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon, I have a Teespring. You can buy merch on Teespring, so things like shirts, posters, stickers, hoodies, socks. And if you don't want to buy anything, well, there's the Patreon, and you can just support me directly monthly, which also gives you access to the AHOC supporters Discord, where there's like early access to videos and bonus videos, which are basically bonus videos can be described as overclocking related videos that Buildzoid thinks are too terrible to release to the general public. Like, they're bad in terms of quality. So, yeah. And I also you also kind of get pilot episodes as bonus videos. Like when I have an idea and I'm like, I'm not sure if it makes a good video. Anyway, who cares? Thanks for watching, and goodbye.